June 19, 1944, Western Pacific, 06:41 hours. The sea is deceptively calm, steel blue, barely rippled, like it doesn't yet know what's coming. On the forward fire control platform of a U.S. battleship, men stand motionless, eyes locked on instruments glowing faintly in the dawn. Salt hangs in the air. The ship's hull hums with restrained violence, 12,000 tons of armor and machinery breathing beneath their boots. Somewhere deep below, powder bags are being hoisted, silk-wrapped, heavy-handled like live animals. No one speaks loudly. At this range, noise feels unnecessary. The Japanese flagship is over the horizon, too distant to resolve cleanly through glass. To the naked eye, there is nothing but haze and curvature, but inside the plotting room, the target exists with unnerving clarity. Range extreme. Bearing steady. Course confirmed. Radar pulses return in disciplined intervals, feeding data into mechanical fire control computers, analog machines of brass gears and rotating shafts translating distance into inevitability. Every few seconds, the solution refines itself. The flagship is maneuvering with its formation. But it is not maneuvering randomly. That is the opening. Battleships are built for salvos, 8 guns, 9 guns, whole broadsides walking across enemy hulls in thunderous correction. Saturation ensures damage, volume compensates for uncertainty. But this morning, volume is not the objective. Precision is. The American fire control officer studies the data carefully, wind drift adjusted, barrel wear factored in, powder temperature calculated against humidity. The target's projected position is plotted not for where it is, but for where it will be when steel arrives. The decision settles quietly. 1 gun. Not a ranging pair. Not a half salvo. 1. If the solution is correct, a single shell will confirm it without telegraphing full intent. If wrong, correction can follow before the enemy fully reacts. On the turret deck, the crew locks into ritual. Breech open. Shell rammed forward. Powder bags seated. Breech sealed. The 16-inch rifle elevates with mechanical patience. Its barrel moves only slightly, but that fraction of degree translates to miles of arc. The horizon looks empty. Stand by. Men brace instinctively. The deck beneath them feels alive, as if aware of what it is about to release. Fire. The concussion is not sound, it is force. Flame erupts from the muzzle in a sheet of violent orange. The entire battleship recoils subtly against its own mass. Smoke sweeps backward across the deck. Then silence. The shell is airborne, invisible against morning light. It travels for nearly a minute, rising high into atmosphere, falling back along a trajectory calculated to the yard. Inside the plotting room, radar operators watch for distortion. Seconds stretch. Then a return flickers differently, irregular, jagged. Observers strain through optics. On the faint outline of the Japanese flagship, something blooms high along the superstructure. Not a splash. A strike. 1 shell. At extreme range. And almost instantly, signal traffic within the enemy formation falters. Maneuvers lag. Destroyers hesitate before altering course. Gunnery rhythm fractures subtly. The flagship is still afloat. But it is no longer commanding cleanly. The battleship's massive battery had not roared in chorus. It had whispered once, and that whisper had landed exactly where it needed to. On the Japanese flagship, the morning had begun with confidence. Signals moved cleanly across the formation. Flag hoists were crisp. Radio traffic was disciplined. The admiral and his staff stood inside the armored bridge structure, tracking the American fleet through optics and intermittent reports. The range felt safe. Extreme. Engagement was expected, but not immediate disruption. Then the shell arrived. There was no warning whistle audible above the wind, no visible splash to correct from. At that distance, the projectile descended almost vertically, armor-piercing and immense, carrying kinetic force built across miles of arc. It struck high. The impact tore through the upper superstructure near the command spaces, detonating after penetration. Steel fragmented inward. Glass shattered instantly. Signal equipment disintegrated in a violent burst of flame and debris. Inside the bridge, the world became concussion and smoke. Men were thrown off their feet, charts vanished in fire, communications panels sparked violently. One instant there had been structure and voice, the next, disorientation. The admirals survived. But the bridge did not remain functional. Primary voice circuits failed, signal lamps went dark, flag lockers were damaged, radio traffic became intermittent, then fragmented. Damage control teams surged upward, but smoke and heat forced hesitation before access could be restored. For a fleet in maneuver, hesitation is lethal. Destroyers awaiting course confirmation received nothing. Cruisers delayed fire adjustments, unsure whether orders had changed. Secondary command nodes attempted to interpret partial transmissions, but uncertainty spread faster than clarity. From a distance, the flagship still appeared intact. It had not suffered catastrophic hull damage. It was not sinking, but it was no longer transmitting authority cleanly. The psychological effect was immediate. Formation commanders sensed disruption without fully understanding its source. Orders lagged seconds longer than usual. Maneuvers lost crisp synchronization. The invisible thread that bound the fleet into coordinated motion had frayed. All from one shell. Extreme-range fire was supposed to be suppressive, volume, intimidation, attrition. Instead, this single round had struck at the nerve center. Back aboard the American Battleship, observers confirmed damage through radar distortion and optical flashes. The fire control officer did not celebrate. He did not order an immediate full broadside. He watched, because the purpose of the shot was not destruction. It was interruption. And interruption was already visible in the enemy's behavior. The flagship attempted to restore command through auxiliary channels. Secondary signal teams relayed improvised orders, but rhythm once broken does not resume instantly. In naval combat, coordination is tempo. Tempo had just shifted. One gun, one shot, and across miles of Pacific water, an entire command structure was now fighting not only an enemy fleet, but its own sudden silence. On the American battleship, no one rushed to fire again. That restraint was deliberate. Inside the plotting room, officers studied the radar returns carefully. The distortion from the flagship remained irregular, superstructure damage, likely communications compromised, but the hull maintained speed. The formation still existed, though its movements were no longer as synchronized. The fire control officer understood something critical. A full broadside now would announce pattern. Multiple splashes allow correction, but they also allow the enemy to interpret bearing, bracket range, and respond. A single shell, properly placed, disrupts without revealing full firing rhythm. The first shot had not been a gamble. It had been proof. Extreme-range gunnery in 1944 was no longer guesswork. Radar fed continuous bearing and range. The Mark 8 fire control radar tracked targets beyond visual distance. Mechanical rangerkeepers converted that data into predictive firing solutions, compensating for own-ship roll, wind velocity, projectile drift, even barrel wear. Where older battles required visual spotting corrections, this engagement relied on mathematics, updated in real time. The American solution had been clean. Now the question was tempo. The flagship's silence created a coordination vacuum. Japanese ships were maneuvering, but not cohesively. Some turned slightly off expected arcs. Others maintained prior headings too long. Destroyers hesitated before screening adjustments. This was the window. The American captain did not order immediate saturation. He ordered confirmation. A second turret adjusted elevation minutely, not to fire yet, but to track. The plotting room refined calculations again, this time projecting not just the flagship's path, but the ripple effect of its damaged command. Without centralized coordination, formation integrity degrades subtly. Speed harmonization falters, turn synchronization lags. And lag creates vulnerability. Another single gun was selected. Not to destroy the flagship outright. To widen disruption. The barrel elevated. Stand by. The battleship's deck vibrated again as a second massive round left the muzzle, another solitary arc crossing miles of open Pacific. This time, the target was not the exact bridge. It was adjacent, secondary fire control infrastructure. Moments later, another distortion bloomed near the already damaged superstructure. The effect was cumulative. On the Japanese flagship, emergency command shifted lower in the ship. Officers relayed orders through alternate circuits, but transitions under fire introduced delay. And delay in fleet maneuver multiplies. From the American perspective, this was not brute force. It was surgical pressure. The massive 16-inch rifles, designed to devastate armor belts, were being used like precision instruments. Each shell calculated not just for impact, but for influence. Across the water, the Japanese fleet's movements grew fractionally uneven. Fractional unevenness becomes visible quickly at scale. One battleship gun, fired deliberately, had broken clarity. A second widened the fracture. And now, before broadsides ever thundered in full chorus, the battle's command structure had already tilted. Extreme range had not protected the flagship. It had only given the American gunners more time to calculate. At first, the disruption was subtle. A cruiser on the flagship's port quarter delayed its turn by a few seconds, awaiting confirmation that never came. A destroyer adjusted speed independently, unsure whether to tighten the screen or widen it. Gunnery commands that should have arrived in crisp sequence began arriving in fragments. From a distance, the Japanese fleet still looked formidable. But its rhythm had changed. Naval formations function like orchestras, each ship playing its role according to timing directed from a central authority. When the conductor falters, the music does not stop immediately. It hesitates, it overlaps, it drifts slightly off tempo. Under radar-directed fire, slight drift is fatal. American plotting officers noticed it instantly. Bearings between ships were widening unevenly. Speed harmonization was no longer perfect. The once disciplined arcs of maneuver now showed microcorrections, evidence of ships acting semi-independently. The flagship was still afloat, but it was no longer synchronizing the fleet. That realization altered American posture. Now came the saturation. Not random broadsides, but staggered salvos calculated against ships whose maneuver windows were widening. The battleship's main battery thundered in controlled sequence, each turret firing according to updated solutions. Shell splashes began walking across multiple hulls. Without unified command, Japanese ships reacted individually. Some turned aggressively to evade. Others maintained previous courses, expecting coordinated adjustment that never materialized. A destroyer cut too sharply across another's arc, forcing emergency correction. Coordination degraded further. Inside the damaged flagship, secondary command struggled to reassert clarity. Officers shouted through smoke-filled compartments. Messengers ran physically between stations when circuits failed, but physical relay cannot match electronic immediacy. Every minute, without clean command, widened the gap. American radar required no pause. Every adjustment by a Japanese ship created a new solution set. Instead of solving one cohesive pattern, fire control now solved multiple independent ones. Predictability had not vanished, it had multiplied. A cruiser absorbed a heavy hit amidships. Another vessel slowed under flooding. Destroyers attempting to rescreen found themselves misaligned by degrees that, at range, translated into vulnerability. The battle had not been decided by weight of metal alone. It had been decided by tempo. The single opening shot had not crippled the fleet physically. It had crippled its timing. And timing, once lost in modern naval combat, is nearly impossible to reclaim. Across miles of Pacific water, smoke columns began marking ships that had entered the fight intact and now struggled to maintain cohesion. The American battleship had treated its massive guns not as blunt instruments, but as tools of disruption. One carefully placed round had silenced a bridge. That silence had fractured command, and that fracture was now expanding outward, ship by ship. The range was still extreme, but the outcome was drawing closer by the minute. Inside the Japanese flagship, smoke thickened in layers. Emergency lighting flickered across steel bulkheads, blackened by concussion. Damage control teams fought to contain fires in upper compartments, while engineers reported partial communication failure between bridge and secondary command posts. The admiral was alive, but command was fractured. Primary signaling equipment had been destroyed. Radio transmission was intermittent. Flag hoists were unreliable in drifting smoke. Orders now traveled slower, relayed verbally, carried physically, repeated cautiously to avoid error. Caution replaced confidence. Across the fleet, hesitation became visible. A battleship awaiting course correction held steady longer than it should have. A cruiser, uncertain whether to tighten formation or widen spacing, split the difference and exposed its flank. Destroyers screened unevenly, some overcompensating, others lagging behind expected arcs. The American gunnery teams noticed immediately. Radar did not care about smoke or confusion. It saw motion, it measured deviation, it translated hesitation into targeting advantage. Salvos began landing not just with accuracy, but with intent. Where a ship slowed slightly to interpret delayed orders, a shell bracketed its new position. Where another accelerated abruptly to compensate, fire adjusted mid-cycle. The Japanese fleet still possessed firepower. Its guns still answered. But return salvos lacked synchronization. Range corrections varied from ship to ship. Some vessels fired based on outdated bearings, while others attempted fresh solutions. Without centralized timing, volleys arrived scattered rather than concentrated. The difference was subtle, but devastating. Modern naval combat rewards unified rhythm. Guns that fire in coordinated pattern maximize bracketing efficiency. Guns firing independently reduce cumulative pressure. The flagship's damaged bridge had done more than silence an officer. It had disrupted cadence. Back aboard the American battleship, observers watched the fragmentation unfold almost clinically. They had not intended to sink the flagship outright, though that remained possible. The objective had been simpler. Break the spine. And once broken, let physics and tempo do the rest. Another salvo roared outward. Another ship faltered. The Japanese formation, once disciplined and precise, now resembled a cluster of powerful but isolated actors, each responding locally to pressure rather than collectively shaping it. The sea between them filled with smoke columns and interrupted wakes. The extreme range that had once provided comfort now offered no sanctuary. Radar bridged distance effortlessly. The mathematics of fire did not weaken with miles. The flagship remained afloat, but it no longer commanded the battle. And without command, even the most formidable fleet becomes a collection of targets. One gun, one deliberate decision. And across open Pacific water, an entire structure of coordination had begun to unravel, not explosively, but incrementally. In modern naval warfare, incremental collapse is often the most decisive kind. Because once tempo shifts, it rarely shifts back. At extreme range, distance is supposed to buy time. Time to maneuver. Time to correct. Time to regain cohesion. But once command fractured, distance became irrelevant. The Japanese fleet was still miles away, well beyond what earlier generations of naval officers would have considered decisive engagement range. Yet radar erased the advantage of separation. Solutions were updated continuously. Bearing shifts were tracked instantly. The American battleship no longer needed to close the gap. It only needed to maintain clarity. And clarity belonged entirely to the side whose command remained intact. As the Japanese ships attempted to re-establish structured movement, inconsistencies multiplied. One vessel turned 3 degrees off anticipated arc. Another adjusted speed too late to maintain spacing. Destroyers screening unevenly created temporary exposure corridors. Each deviation was captured by radar. Each deviation became a firing solution. American salvos intensified, not wild, not desperate, but methodical. Heavy shells landed with calculated progression, walking across formation geometry that had once been disciplined but now drifted subtly apart. The Flagship still signaled, through secondary channels, through improvised relays, but every command carried delay. And delay under radar fire is measurable. The range had been extreme, but the battle was now intimate in consequence. Because once coordination falters, every mile feels shorter. Individually, the Japanese ships remained formidable. Their armor was thick. Their guns were powerful. Their crews were experienced. But fleets do not win battles as individuals. They win through synchronization. Without a fully functional flagship, that synchronization degraded rapidly. Fire control corrections that should have been centralized became localized. Ships interpreted partial data independently. Return salvos lacked unified timing. Power became isolated. And isolated power is vulnerable to concentration. American gunnery officers exploited this immediately. Instead of distributing fire evenly, they began focusing on ships whose maneuver suggested uncertainty. A cruiser that hesitated received concentrated attention. A destroyer that drifted too far from screen alignment became a priority. The battle shifted from fleet versus fleet to system versus fragments. The Japanese vessels were still dangerous, but they were no longer harmonized. The single shot that struck the Flagship had not sunk it. It had separated power from coordination. And separation in a radar-guided battle compounds quickly. Saturation fire overwhelms. Precision fire destabilizes. That morning in the Western Pacific, the American battleship chose destabilization first. One gun, one calculated solution. Not to annihilate, but to interrupt. Once interruption succeeded, the remainder required only sustained pressure. Radar preserved clarity, mechanical fire control preserved accuracy. The Japanese fleet, deprived of immediate centralized command, struggled to regain its earlier rhythm. Modern naval warfare had evolved beyond visibility. It now rewarded those who could process information fastest and act on it cleanly. The Flagship had not expected to be struck at such range with such exactness. But extreme range did not weaken mathematics. It strengthened it. Because time of flight allowed full solution refinement. The shot that seemed improbable had been inevitable once data aligned. By the time the firing slowed, the Japanese Flagship still floated. Damage was severe, but survivable. What was not survivable was the loss of tempo. Even as emergency command stabilized internally, the fleet's earlier cohesion had dissolved. Ships maneuvered more cautiously. Engagement confidence wavered. Reaction cycles lengthened. The American battleship, meanwhile, retained clarity from beginning to end. The battle had not been decided by the heaviest broadside. It had been decided by the first precise interruption. Extreme range fire did not just strike steel. It struck structure. One battleship gun. One deliberate decision. One shell arcing across miles of Pacific dawn. The hit did not sink the Japanese flagship instantly. It did something more decisive. It fractured command. From that fracture flowed hesitation. From hesitation flowed desynchronization. From desynchronization flowed vulnerability. The American crew did not rely on overwhelming noise. They relied on mathematics. Extreme range was no longer a shield in modern naval warfare. It was a canvas for precision. And precision, applied at the right moment against the right target, can cripple an entire fleet's coordination faster than any barrage. The sea that morning looked calm, almost indifferent. But beneath that calm, one calculation had shifted the balance. Not through saturation. Through a single, exacting shot.